Tonight we're exploring the life of Ernest Hemingway, the man who the New York Times called the most significant author since Shakespeare, a Nobel Prize-winning author and adventurer. Some psychologists paint Hemingway as a hyper-masculine adventurer. Others say he was a womanizing, chauvinist degenerate. Although both are basically accurate, when one takes a deep dive into Hemingway's psychology, these accusations are vastly incomplete. There is a more profound and rarely told story of Ernest Hemingway, a tragic story about a man predestined to destroy himself through a number of factors well outside of his control. Hemingway was doomed from the start. Before you get comfortable, as always, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if you enjoy our content. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's time now to dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's cover the unusual life and death of Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway was born in 1899 in the prosperous suburb of Oak Park, Illinois, less than 10 miles from downtown Chicago, a place he would later describe as a town of wide lawns and narrow minds. His father, Clarence, was a family doctor, and his mother, Grace, a singer who declined a contract at the Metropolitan Opera in New York to return to her hometown and marry apparently because she thought that being exposed to bright theatre lights might further harm her delicate eyes, which had been damaged by scarlet fever as a child. Ernest was the second born of their 6 children, all of whom were delivered by their father. Clarence Hemingway was a strict Christian conservative and a vicious disciplinarian who likely suffered from undiagnosed bipolar disorder. He would spank and beat his son with a leather strap. Clarence suffered from abrupt, serious mood swings. These depressive episodes required him to spend large amounts of time in isolation, living far away from the Hemingways' Illinois home. Throughout Hemingway's life, his father expressed disdain for almost everything that the author produced. In one instance, he called a short story of Ernest's filth that should not have been published anywhere. Ernest's opinion of his father seemed to swing wildly throughout his life. There were times in childhood and adulthood when he admired Clarence Hemingway, but notably, as a child, Ernest had a ritual. He would hide in his family's shed with a shotgun, lining his father's head up in the sights of the loaded firearm, as if performing a sort of mock assassination of his own father. Throughout his life, Dr. Clarence had a recurring, crippling battle with depression. In his 50s, he lost that battle once and for all. Clarence took his own life, shooting himself in the head with a pistol. This is perhaps the moment that divides Ernest's life into a BC and AD. When his father died, Ernest remarked that it was as if his own life had been shot out from under him. After this incident, his alcoholism and destructive personality traits snowballed like never before. Ernest hated his mother, not in the way that a spoiled teenager hates their mom, but in a deep, unrelenting and permanent way. As a boy, Grace insisted that Ernest be dressed like a girl. Grace did not do housework, focusing her energy instead on painting and encouraging the children to explore literature, art, and music. She read them hundreds of books, taught them songs and poetry, and took them to the opera, theatre, and museums. She insisted all of her children learn a musical instrument and kept Ernest out of school for a year to scratch away at the cello. It was his father who took a more active role in the domestic chores of the household, planning meals, cooking, and helping with the laundry supported by living maids and nannies. But it wasn't all books, singing, and frilly clothes. Ernest developed a passion for hunting and fishing, nurtured by his father on summers spent at their country home on Walloon Lake in northern Michigan, a love of the outdoors which stayed with him throughout his life. But his father would have sudden switches of mood and angry outbursts, often taking it out on Ernest. He suffered from episodes of profound depression and had to spend periods away from the family to lift his spirits, sometimes at the lake house, sometimes in New Orleans. Ernest's rage toward his mother began at a young age. Grace would often refer to Ernest as Dutch Dolly, while the boy called his mother Fruity. At the age of 2, Grace once called Ernest Dutch Dolly, and he responded with, "I am not Dutch Dolly. Bang, bang. I shoot sweetie." So, in his childhood, Ernest expressed a desire to shoot both of his parents. When his father committed suicide, Ernest blamed his mother entirely. In numerous communications, journals, and letters, Ernest would later refer to his mother as fat and said that her controlling, domineering personality drove his father to kill himself. His hatred never ceased. Looking at other members of the Hemingway family, it's easy to see a pattern of intense psychiatric disability. His mother, Grace, suffered from anxiety and insomnia. Two of Ernest's uncles struggled with similar issues. Two of Ernest's 5 siblings committed suicide. A third died in 1963, officially due to natural causes, but the family strongly suspected suicide. So, of the 6 Hemingway children, 4 of them committed suicide. It is likely that Ernest and his own father both suffered from bipolar disorder. Ernest Hemingway's youngest son, Gregory, was diagnosed with this same condition during his life. Although a practicing doctor, Gregory lost his medical license after having uncontrollable substance abuse issues. Throughout his life, Gregory's struggles led to multiple psychiatric hospitalizations and arrests. He eventually died of natural causes in a Miami jail. Ernest's granddaughter suffered from bulimia, depression, and a seizure disorder before eventually killing herself. That was 6 suicides in 4 generations of the Hemingway family. Hemingway was born with a generational talent for writing, but he was also born with a litany of incurable and eventually fatal mental disorders. Throughout his life, Ernest self-reported depressive episodes over and over again. In one letter, he told a friend, "I felt that gigantic bloody emptiness and nothingness, like I couldn't ever fight right and was all for death." This is just one example, but he would go on to report profound instances of depression throughout his life. Hemingway's first major biographer categorized him as a temperamental manic depressive and said that he swung wildly forever between megalomania and melancholy. This biographer wrote that his mood swung so quickly that he may as well have been exhilarated and depressed at the same time. This radical swinging would manifest itself in his work too. Hemingway often described a feeling of juice and said it was as bad as any disease. With this juice, Hemingway could produce massive amounts of truly masterful writing in very short amounts of time. His novel, The Sun Also Rises, is often seen as a masterpiece. Hemingway wrote in just 8 weeks. These were likely undiagnosed manic episodes. One of Hemingway's wives wrote that the protagonist of his depression was his liver. For virtually his entire life, Hemingway suffered from severe alcohol dependence. He likely began drinking as a teenager after joining World War I. In October 1917, he joined the Missouri National Guard. In February 1918, the American Red Cross announced it was seeking volunteers to join the ambulance service in Italy, and Hemingway signed up. After 2 weeks of training in New York, Hemingway and his fellow volunteers were dispatched off to France for brief stops in Bordeaux and Paris, which was under bombardment from the Germans' massive new Kaiser Wilhelm gun 70 miles away, and then he was in Milan. His first assignment was to help transport the injured and dead from a massive munitions plant explosion. It was a grisly scene, with the bodies and body parts of female workers strewn everywhere, but Hemingway was unfazed, saying it was just like the General Hospital back in Kansas City. In his letters home, he couldn't hide his enthusiasm and excitement at being in Italy and doing something worthwhile, telling them he was having a wonderful time. A few days later, he was sent to the front line at Fossalta di Piave, 20 miles from Venice. He was taking chocolate and cigarettes to troops in a dugout when an Austrian mortar shell landed just a few feet away from him. The blow knocked him unconscious and half buried him. Shrapnel ripped into his right foot and knee and struck his thighs, scalp, and hand. 2 Italian soldiers standing between Hemingway and the shell's point of impact were not so lucky. One was killed instantly, and another had his legs blown off and died soon afterward. A third was badly wounded, and this one Hemingway hauled onto his back and, despite his own injuries, carried him to the first aid station, picking up some extra machine gun wounds in the bargain. His bravery earned him an Italian War Medal. He required immediate surgery at a distribution center and then 5 days of treatment in a field hospital before being transferred for recuperation to the Red Cross Hospital in Milan. There, he spent 3 months recovering from his injuries and slowly falling in love with Agnes von Karofsky, a vivacious and flirty American Red Cross nurse 7 years his senior. In October, she was sent to Florence, and a fortnight later, Hemingway was dispatched to the Monte Grappa front, where he promptly contracted hepatitis and had to be returned to the hospital. Agnes, too, returned, and they picked up their romance for 9 heady days before she was sent off to another hospital. He wrote passionate letters to her daily, and she responded in equally affectionate terms, sometimes signing herself Cattiva Raga, or Naughty Girl. Hemingway returned home on the SS Giuseppe Verdi in January 1919, urging Agnes to join him as soon as possible so they could be married. Although still only 19, he started saving for their wedding and continued writing daily. But the frequency and tone of Agnes's letters cooled off, and in March she wrote to say she was engaged to an Italian officer. She never married her Italian officer, but when Hemingway heard from a mutual friend that she was coming back to the US, he expressed a devout hope that she might trip on the gangplank and knock out her front teeth. Hemingway's experiences in Italy plunged the young man, with his middle-class, privileged upbringing, into the extremes of human suffering and brutality. He saw with his own eyes the fragility of existence, the barbarism of war, but also the courage and nobility that can emerge from such darkness, themes which would form a major part of his writing throughout his life. His physical wounds left scars, but his rejection by Agnes also scarred him. One biographer suggests that, as a result, in subsequent relationships, Hemingway always followed a pattern of abandoning a new wife before she could abandon him. But it seems to me that these were never thought-out decisions. Rather, he just got bored with one and moved on to whoever else was around at the time. But I do think that he had mental scars from the war. He was only 18 when he came so close to dying or being permanently disabled. He said later of the incident, "When you go to war as a boy, you have a great illusion of immortality. Other people get killed, not you. Then when you are badly wounded the first time, you lose that illusion, and you know it can happen to you." The role of trauma in the evolution of Hemingway's personality and writing has been relatively underplayed. And by trauma, we need to consider both the psychological aspects of witnessing the terrible sights of mutilated bodies in the munitions factory catastrophe, as well as the survivor guilt of being so close to men who were blown to pieces in front of him, and the physical trauma of being next to an exploding mortar round. Modern ideas about post-traumatic stress disorder were not formulated until the 1980s, and at the time of the First World War, all sorts of names were given to the stress reactions of combat personnel. One of the main theories about the cause of shell shock at the time was that it was the result of barotrauma, or the shock wave from an explosion. And to this day, neuroscientists are still debating the role of mild traumatic brain injury in combat veterans with PTSD. But whatever name is put to it, and whatever the exact mechanism is, war changes people. It always has, and it changed Hemingway. Back in the US, smarting from his rejection and struggling to readjust to the routines of normal life, he threw himself into his outdoor pursuits to try and find some peace, and took a job with the Toronto Star Weekly, which gave him his first bylines. One of his articles was a bitingly satirical piece about Canadians who avoided the war. Then it was on to Chicago, where he met his first wife, Hadley Richardson. Although 8 years his senior, she was painfully shy and had what he described as a nurturing instinct. Her father had ended his life when she was 12, believing he had financial difficulties, and her mother had just passed away. But none of that mattered. Hemingway was infatuated and immediately knew she was the girl he was going to marry. After a honeymoon at the Hemingway Lake House, where they had miserable weather and both came down with fevers, they headed to Paris, funded by Hadley's inheritance and Hemingway's job as a foreign correspondent. The couple lived in a cramped apartment in the Latin Quarter above a rowdy dance hall, and Hemingway worked in a room he rented nearby. They had introductions to the American expatriate writers living in Paris, Ezra Pound and Gertrude Stein, and they met James Joyce at the famous Shakespeare and Company bookshop. Hemingway filed over 80 stories for the Toronto Star, covering the war between Greece and Turkey, as well as travel pieces. His style of reporting was fresh and new. He wanted the reader back home to understand the impact of events on ordinary people, the hidden costs of war, the displacement of peoples from their native lands, the hunger, the disease, the suffering. The couple journeyed around the continent to Spain, Italy, and Germany, sometimes together and sometimes apart. The first big test of their relationship was when Hadley, waiting for a train to Geneva at the Gare de Lyon, lost a suitcase filled with Hemingway's manuscripts. She was in tears for the entire 8-hour journey, but on her arrival, Hemingway was reassuring, telling her not to worry as he had carbon copies. When she then told him the suitcase contained the manuscripts, the carbon copies, and all of his notes, he wasn't quite so calm, rushing back to Paris to see if anything was left behind. But there was just a single short story left in his novel, and all the other stories were gone forever. But undeterred and determined to regroup, he knuckled down into recreating the work he had lost. His relationship with Hadley was never quite the same afterward, however. He couldn't have been in a better place for a budding writer. 1920s Paris was the epicenter of the artistic revolution, transforming literature, music, the visual arts, fashion, architecture, and pretty much every field of human endeavor. New ideas in one art form inspired innovations in another, and the Hemingways were regular visitors to the soirees organized by Gertrude Stein, the Earth Mother of modernism, where they met other writers and painters, including Picasso and Miro. In September 1923, the couple returned to Toronto, where, a month later, their son was born, John Hadley Nicanor, named after a Spanish matador Ernest had seen during their visit to Pamplona for the famous festival of San Fermin and running of the bulls. With baby Jack just a few months old, the family returned to Paris and moved into a new apartment, not much larger and uncomfortably close to a busy sawmill, the incessant noise of which forced Hemingway to retreat to his favorite cafes to work. But he did manage to get his first books published, 3 stories and 10 poems, and an experimental slim volume of 18 vignettes or ultra-short stories of no more than a few lines each. He was also working on a novel and helping Ford Madox Ford edit the short-lived but influential Transatlantic Review, which published works by Pound, Dos Passos, Joyce, the eccentric German poet and artist Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven, and Gertrude Stein, as well as some of his own short stories. And he met the ultimate burn-the-candle-at-both-ends couple, Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. He got on well with Scott, who was encouraging about his work, but he did not like Zelda, considering her to be mad and feeling that she was taking Scott away from his more serious writing. The dislike was mutual. Zelda, believing Hemingway to be a phony. Everything seemed to be going well, but in the winter of 1925, Hemingway met and began an affair with 32-year-old Pauline Pfeiffer, an independently wealthy journalist from Arkansas who had moved to Paris to work for Vogue magazine. When Hadley found out, she agreed to a separation, but insisted on a 100-day period of him not seeing Pauline. Hemingway agreed, but then sank into a state of abject depression and had morbid thoughts of ending it all, such that his friends were genuinely worried. He felt guilty. Hadley had done nothing wrong and had always been supportive of his literary aspirations. So how much of his dejection was genuine, and how much a self-indulgent orgy of self-castigation, as described by one writer, is unclear. But as soon as he was reunited with Pauline, he felt better, and he was able to reassure Fitzgerald that he was all through with a general bumping-off phase. In 1926, The Sun Also Rises was published. It portrays the lives and attitudes of a hard-drinking, fast-living set of disillusioned young expatriates in post-war Paris, for whom the war had changed everything. It received mixed reviews. However, some critics loved it, but others hated it, struggling to connect with the character's disenfranchisement with life. The fiercest criticism came from his mother, who told him he was prostituting a great ability to the lowest uses, and that it is a doubtful honor to produce one of the filthiest books of the year. 4 months after his divorce from Hadley, he converted to Catholicism and married Pauline Pfeiffer. They honeymooned in Le Grau de Roy in the south of France, where he contracted anthrax, a bacterial infection caught from livestock or animal products that was still relatively common in Europe at the time, and which was fatal in 20% of cases. He's still only 27, but he's almost had his crown jewels ripped off by shrapnel. He's been machine-gunned, he's had hepatitis, and now anthrax. And this is just the beginning of the catalogue of injuries and ailments he'll go on to suffer throughout his life. His next collection, Men Without Women, 14 short stories, was published later in the year. Again, some critics loved it. Cosmopolitan magazine's editor-in-chief calling his boxing tale 50 grand, One of the best stories that ever came into my hands, but others hated it. Author Joseph Wood Crutch, calling the collection sordid little catastrophes about very vulgar people. By the end of the year, Pauline was pregnant and wanted to move back to America. So on the recommendation of John Dos Passos, they set sail for Key West. Florida, but not before. Hemingway gashed his head open and concussed himself by pulling a skylight down on his head, thinking it was a toilet chain. This left him with a prominent forehead scar for the rest of his life, which he was always a little shy to talk about, seeing as how it didn't quite fit his He-Man adventurer image. He had lived in Paris for 6 years, first with Hadley and then with Pauline, but when he left, he would never again live in a big city. It's hard to imagine Hemingway without Paris. The connections he made with modernist writers and artists in the melting pot of ideas of the Années Folles, the crazy years, were pivotal in developing his style and giving him the confidence to try something new, to find his own voice. People visit Paris to breathe in some of that history. La Closerie des Lilas, Le Dôme, and Harry's New York bar. His favourite was La Closerie des Lilas in Montparnasse, where they even have his customary place at the bar marked with a plaque, and of course, Shakespeare and Company. All still doing business and all worth a visit. After spending time in Key West, they travelled to Kansas City, where their son Patrick was born in June. Pauline had a difficult delivery, but never one to waste good material. Papa Hemingway managed to incorporate a fictionalized version of the event into his next novel. In December 1928, he was about to board a train back to Florida when he received a cable telling him that his father had taken his own life. He knew his father had been ruminating about money, and he had written to him trying to tell him not to worry, but his letter arrived just a few minutes too late. His mother had written in March to say that Clarence was in very bad shape. Heart attacks, cramps, and neuritis in his right arm, so he cannot lift it to shave or brush his hair. And in November, Dad has been falling off terribly in weight and appetite and unable to sleep, and last week he seemed to go all to pieces. He really thought he was going to die. At the inquest, the family tried to gloss over his long history of mental ill health, as it was far more acceptable to succumb to diabetes and financial worries than be tainted by the suspicion of insanity. But Ernest had no illusions, saying, "I'll probably go the same way eventually." 3, possibly 4 of the 6 Hemingway children took their own lives. Ernest in 1960, 1, Ursula in 1960, 6, Lester, also a writer, in 1982, and although his eldest sister Marceline's death in 1963 was deemed to have been from natural causes, some in the family suspected otherwise. But Hemingway just tried to get his head down and finish his novel. It was a struggle, though he tried out 47 different endings before settling on one. It was serialized in Scribner's magazine in 1929, but with much of his character's earthy dialogue censored. The F-word was obviously never going to be allowed in the 1920s, but for some reason, bedpan had to go as well, and the scenes of love, that are very sparingly described in the uncensored version, no more than hints, really, also had to go. Hemingway was furious, but he knew he had no choice. The critics were positive, and the book sold well, confirming his status as a major American writer, and an Oscar-nominated movie soon followed. For the first time, he was earning a living from his writing. In the early 1930s, he spent his winters in Key West and summers in Wyoming, where he hunted deer, elk, and grizzly bear, often joined by friends and family. But when driving back from an expedition to Yellowstone with John Dos Passos one time, he came off the road and sustained a serious spiral fracture of his right upper arm. His surgeon bound the bone with a kangaroo tendon and then immobilized it by bandaging it to his chest. Hemingway was in the hospital for 7 weeks, but his damaged radial nerve, supplying the muscles in his hand, took a year to fully recover, during which time he suffered intense pain and had restricted movement. His 3rd child was born in November 1931 in Kansas City, another difficult birth, after which Pauline was advised to have no further children. Assigned male at birth and named Gregory, Gloria underwent gender reassignment surgery in her 60s and, after a difficult life battling bipolar disorder, alcohol, and drugs, died in the Miami-Dade Women's Detention Center after being arrested on charges of indecent exposure and resisting arrest. But back in 1931, life was good. Pauline's uncle bought the growing family a house in Key West with a carriage house, which they converted into a writing studio. Ernest would wake up early and write during the mornings when there was no one around to disturb him, but afternoons and evenings were playtime fishing, sailing, and drinking sessions at his favourite bar, Sloppy Joe's. In 1932, Death in the Afternoon was published, a non-fiction book about the history and traditions of Spanish bullfighting that he had become fascinated by on his trips to Pamplona. In 1933, he went on a 10-week safari to Kenya and Tanganyika with Pauline. The trip provided material for another non-fiction work, Green Hills of Africa, as well as a number of short stories, and allowed him to blast away at anything that moved on the Serengeti. Now, I know some people love hunting, but for me, the images of Hemingway grinning over his African kills are a bit of a problem. Fishing? Fine. But shooting rhinos and elephants? Really? But at the time, big game hunting was a popular pastime for the well-heeled, who wanted to show how brave they were, and this is just as much a part of Hemingway's life as clacking away at his typewriter in a Parisian garret. During his travels, Hemingway contracted amoebic dysentery, a protozoal gut infection. Another of his illnesses that is relatively easily treated nowadays, but in the pre-antibiotic era was a real killer. There was a US outbreak in the same year at the Chicago World's Fair that affected 1,000 people, of whom 98 died. Hemingway was lucky, though he just suffered a prolapsed rectum and had to be flown to a hospital in Nairobi. Green Hills of Africa was published in 1935 to unenthusiastic reviews. He felt the critics had killed his book, and went into a deep depression, saying he was ready to blow his lousy head off. He also began to blame his wife and Jane Mason, a glamorous socialite with whom he had been having a torrid affair for 3 years, for somehow souring its reception. Hemingway was 38 years old. He was a major writer, even if some of his books weren't as well received as others. He had a comfortable lifestyle, far enough away in Key West that he had time to himself, but not so far that he was isolated. He had enough money to do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, and he had an adoring family and, at this point, only one ex-wife. But he was bored. He needed something more than knocking back a bottle of scotch a day. Excitement, danger, new love, novelty. And in December 1936, he bumped into Martha Gellhorn, who got him all fired up about going to Spain to cover the Civil War. Understandably, Pauline was not keenly concerned about the dangers, and not just from the war. He went anyway, travelling to Madrid in March 1937, where he penned 31 dispatches for the North American newspaper Alliance, wrote a play, and collaborated as scriptwriter, narrator, and in the production of a pro-Republican film, The Spanish Earth. But where will we go? Where can we live? What can we do for a living? But it was in Spain that he fell out with longtime friend John Dos Passos. At the time, Dos Passos had been on the cover of Time magazine to mark the publication of the 3rd installment of his USA trilogy, which was critically acclaimed and selling well, and he was at least the equal of Hemingway in terms of literary stature. As members of the Lost Generation, they had gotten to know each other in Paris and were good friends. But they parted company in Spain, and the rift was never healed. Later, in Hemingway's posthumously published A Movable Feast, his memoirs of his Paris years, he was very unflattering about Dos Passos, likening him to a pilot fish, a small fish that swims with sharks, gaining from their more powerful companions' ability to scare off predators and feeding off their parasites and scraps. I think it is worth trying to understand why they fell out, as it says quite a lot about Hemingway's personality. The Civil War in Spain had begun in July 1936, and theoretically was between the left-leaning Republican forces and the right-wing nationalist forces. But almost from the outset, there was heavy involvement from other countries, Germany, Italy, and Portugal supporting the nationalists, and the Soviet Union and Mexico supporting the Republicans. And by support, we're talking tanks, aircraft, warships, and thousands of soldiers in a savage conflict that is often referred to as the trial run for World War II. In early 1937, José Robles, a left-wing writer, academic, and translator who was a good friend of Dos Passos, disappeared and was executed, probably on the orders of Alexander Orlov of the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. Hemingway condoned the killing, seeing it as necessary in a time of war, while Dos Passos was concerned about his friend's family and troubled by the abuse of power and Hemingway's willingness to lend his name to Russian fake news to cover up Robles' murder. After their split, Hemingway wrote a thinly disguised article about the episode for Ken magazine, describing Dos Passos' scruples as the good-natured naivety of a typical American liberal attitude, and Dos Passos himself as white as the underhalf of an unsold flounder at 11 in the morning just before the Plouns's fish market shuts. While one can admire the sheer inventiveness of his put-down, this was a recurring theme across Hemingway's life. Former friends would suddenly be turned upon and viciously attacked for daring to disagree with him. Reflecting later without bitterness, Dos Passos wrote that even in their Paris days, long before he was famous, Hemingway was always competitive and critical, overly so, but in the early days, you could kid him out of it. Dos Passos put it down to Hemingway's bad heredity, his overbearing father, and distinctly odd mother. But Spain is also where his relationship with Martha Gellhorn blossomed. On first meeting him in Key West, Martha wrote to her friend Eleanor Roosevelt that he was an odd bird, very lovable and full of fire, and a marvelous storyteller. It's not certain when their working relationship became more intimate. The movie of their lives together gives a version, and some of it certainly happened, but we don't really know which bits are true and which aren't. What we do know, however, is that their affair continued after Spain, between their various assignments, as Hemingway's marriage to Pauline slowly fizzled out. Pauline did not give up without a fight, however, travelling to Paris to surprise him in December 1937, having grown her hair long to how he now liked it. But the meeting was disastrous, with Pauline raging at him for his continued infidelities and threatening to throw herself off the hotel balcony, and Hemingway rushing off to a doctor with acute abdominal pain. He was prescribed medication that was believed at the time to protect his liver and told never to drink again. Gellhorn is now considered one of the finest war correspondents of the 20th century, and she seemed to reinvigorate Hemingway, forcing him out of his cozy, comfortable life in Florida and his 15 scotch and sodas a day, and back out into the dangers of the front line to get a good story. She was different from his previous partners, 9 years younger, but fiercely independent and strong-willed. She was able to stand up to him and did. In 1939, Hemingway finally separated from Pauline and relocated to Cuba with Martha. They leased and later bought a 15-acre, beautiful but dilapidated farmhouse near Havana, the Finca Vigia, where he worked on his next novel, rising at 5 and working till noon, oblivious to everything else going on around him and yelling at anyone making a noise. The house needed a lot of work, and Gellhorn complained to a friend that he was about as much use as a stuffed squirrel, but he was turning out a beautiful story, and Nothing on Earth Besides matters to him. For Whom the Bell Tolls was published the following year to good reviews. It sold 500,000 copies in its first 3 months, and firmly re-established his literary reputation. He also signed a film deal with Paramount, worth nearly $150,000, which made him financially secure. And when his divorce from Pauline was finalized, he married Martha Gellhorn the following year. They traveled to China via Hawaii. Gellhorn had been asked to cover the Sino-Japanese War for Collier's magazine, and Hemingway accompanied her. For the first time in his life, he was not the star of the show, and he didn't particularly enjoy his time in China. Back in Cuba by the end of 1941, Hemingway prepared his boat, the Pilar, for patrolling against German submarines, and managed to persuade the Cuban government to pay for the refit. There are all sorts of stories about him being involved with USS intelligence agencies in Cuba, even with the Soviet NKVD at various points during the war, but his involvement seems to have been peripheral, and any information he supplied no more than what he would have written as a journalist. What he struggled to do, however, was write. He was drinking too much, often late into the night, but that was nothing new, and he was irritable and occasionally violent toward Martha. He was depressed by news of the war, and all of this combined to cause such a complete creative drought that he didn't publish anything of significance in the 1940s. Martha was busy with her career, traveling around the Caribbean and spending months in Europe. When she returned to Cuba, they just argued. Perhaps sensing that time was running out, if he wanted to be part of the war in any way, Hemingway flew to London in May 1944 as an official war correspondent. While being driven back home from a party late one night in the blacked-out city, His driver ploughed into a water tank. Concussed, and with his head and face badly cut, he was taken to St. George's Hospital for treatment, 57 stitches. And this is where Martha caught up with him. She was angry, as she had been forced to spend 3 weeks crossing the Atlantic in a cargo ship filled with dynamite, at the mercy of German U-boats, because her husband had been disinclined to get her a press pass on a plane. So, when she arrived, she was decidedly unsympathetic. Neither was she impressed to find empty bottles of whiskey under his hospital bed. He seemed more interested in drinking and regaling hangers-on in his hotel with his stories than spending time with her, and when he was with her, he couldn't help himself, goading and embarrassing her, often reducing her to tears. Finally, when he stood her up for dinner one night in favor of Mary Welsh, another young American journalist, that was it. Martha told him he was a bully, and she'd had enough. So it was on to 36-year-old Mary Welsh. As usual, he became infatuated and asked her to marry him on only their third meeting, even though she was still married to Noel Monks, an Australian journalist. When day came, Hemingway was on a landing craft at Omaha Beach, and judging from his published account of the experience, you would think that he led the invasion. He was there, all right, but he stayed on the boat and was back in his hotel in time for dinner, while many others on that day were not so fortunate. He returned to France later and became involved with a group of resistance fighters, ending up as some kind of unofficial commander. As a war correspondent, he was not meant to take up arms, of course, and at one point, it looked as if he might get into trouble, but he managed to get away with it by saying he only offered advice. In August 1944, he was present at the liberation of Paris. His new love, Mary, joined him at the Ritz Hotel as he reunited with old friends, including Picasso and Gertrude Stein. In March 1946, after his divorce from Martha came through and Mary's divorce from her husband was finalized, they married in Cuba. He began work on The Garden of Eden, finishing 800 pages by June. The novel is a very modern exploration of male-female relationships and reversal of gender roles, with echoes of the strange menage he had with Hadley and Pauline in the 20s. Although he continued working on it for the rest of his life, he never finished it. A heavily edited version was published posthumously in 1986, and there is a 2008 movie, but both are controversial. Later in the year, Mary had emergency surgery for an ectopic pregnancy, which meant she was unable to have children. In 1947, Hemingway was awarded a Bronze Star for his bravery during World War II. The medal is usually reserved for combat personnel, but occasionally given to civilians, and he was recognized for having been under fire in combat areas in order to obtain an accurate picture of conditions. But the years were beginning to catch up with Ernest Hemingway. His blood pressure was up, as was his weight, and this eventually led to diabetes. He also began to suffer from blinding headaches, all made worse, of course, by his heavy drinking. Having stalled on The Garden of Eden, he began work on a trilogy of sea-themed books, but struggled to make progress, and this, too, was never completed, although it was eventually published posthumously as Islands in the Stream. In 1948, Hemingway and Mary traveled to Europe. The now 49-year-old writer met a girl who would become his muse for the next 5 years and reinvigorate his writing, 18-year-old Adriana Ivanic, from an aristocratic but cash-strapped family. So much of the discussion about their relationship focuses on the did they, didn't they question that it is hard to know what to believe. Adriana herself said they were just friends, but that Hemingway wanted it to be more. How seriously she considered his advances, we don't know, but his Hollywood handsome days were long gone. He had piled on the weight, frazzled his skin with years of Caribbean sun, and according to another woman he fell in love with around this time, actress Ingrid Bergman, his faintly unkempt odor was enough to put anyone off. Mary broke her ankle on the slopes, and Ernest developed a psychosis, a facial skin infection which had to be treated with high doses of penicillin. Like so many of Hemingway's other medical issues, this could have been serious, with the potential to develop into an infection of deeper tissues and threaten his eyesight. As it was, he was just left with his face covered with crusts. He and Mary remained in Venice for several months, with Hemingway sneaking out to meet Adriana in bars. Whatever the nature of their relationship, he was inspired to embark on another novel, Across the River and Into the Trees, his first new book in 10 years. Completed in Cuba, where Adriana visited him, and published in 1950, it was met with hostile reviews. J. Donald Adams in the New York Times described it as one of the saddest books I have ever read, not because I am moved to compassion by the conjunction of love and death in the Colonel's life, but because a great talent has come, whether for now or forever, to such a dead end. Tennessee Williams was almost a lone voice in saying that it was one of Hemingway's finest works. There is a new movie based on the novel, which is due to be released soon and will hopefully do it justice. In October 1956, he returned to Europe, but became sick again and was treated for high blood pressure, liver disease, and arteriosclerosis. Hemingway was furious at the critical reception of his book and threw himself into writing the first draft of The Old Man and the Sea, which he dashed off in only 8 weeks. His shortest novel about an aging and unlucky fisherman's battle with a giant marlin has been described as a testament to resilience and personal triumph, even in the midst of defeat. Published in full in Life in May 1952, the magazine sold over 5 million copies, and the book won the Pulitzer Prize the following year. In January 1954, on his second hunting trip to Africa, Hemingway was seriously injured in 2 plane crashes. He had chartered a sightseeing flight to see the Murchison Falls in what was then the Belgian Congo, but the plane struck a telegraph wire and crash-landed in heavy bush. The next day, they boarded a second plane to get to Uganda for medical care, but this one burst into flames on takeoff. Finding the door jammed, Hemingway used his head as a battering ram twice to force open the door to get out. When they eventually arrived in Uganda, they found reporters covering the story of their deaths, and Hemingway amused himself by reading his obituaries while recovering from his injuries: burns, 2 cracked discs, a damaged kidney, a ruptured liver, a dislocated shoulder, and a fractured skull complicated by cerebrospinal fluid leaking from his ear, and temporary blindness in the right eye. Nothing too serious. He seemed to have recovered and was able to go on a fishing expedition in February with his son Patrick, but he was still in a lot of pain, which made him irritable, and while trying to extinguish their campfire, he fell into the flames and suffered second-degree burns on his legs, torso, lips, left hand, and right forearm. These accidents in quick succession seemed to bring about a physical decline. Although he had been a functioning alcoholic for much of his life, he drank more heavily than ever to combat the pain of his injuries. In October 1954, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature for his mastery of the art of narrative, most recently demonstrated in The Old Man and the Sea, and for the influence he has exerted on contemporary style. Today, I had no idea that I would win the award, but since I have, I'm very pleased. If I had not won it, I would congratulate whoever won it. Listening to some of his interviews at this time, I was struck by how odd his speech sounds. It's very monotone and lacking in normal intonation and prosody. Speech abnormalities can occur in a number of neurological conditions, including traumatic brain injury, dementia, and as a result of cirrhosis. But it has often been said that Hemingway's characteristically lean writing style was also the way he spoke, so maybe it was just him. But there are other recordings of him speaking before and after this, in which he's much more fluent, so it's really hard to know what was going on in his brain at this point. Hemingway modestly told the press that others deserved the prize more than he, but he would gladly accept it anyway. However, he was in too much pain to travel to Stockholm to receive the award. In early 1956, he was bedridden for months. His doctors warned him to stop drinking, as he had clear signs of liver damage, and he listened, for a while, but not for long. The following month, he was in Paris, and while having lunch at the Ritz, he was reminded of 2 trunks he had put into storage in the hotel in 1928 and never retrieved. They contained a ragtag collection of clothes, menus, receipts, hunting paraphernalia, correspondence, and 2 stacks of notebooks listing who he had met and what he had done when he had lived in Paris in the 1920s. Back in Cuba, he excitedly began collecting and editing his notes into his memoir, A Movable Feast, and although he more or less finished the book, it was not published during his lifetime but in a version edited by his widow Mary in 1964. It's a fascinating book, but his negativity about F. Scott Fitzgerald and John Dos Passos does say quite a lot about his insecurities. He was also working on True at First Light, a mixture of fiction and reminiscence about his trip to Africa with Mary, which swelled to over 200,000 words, his Sea Trilogy, and adding chapters to the Garden of Eden. But despite his productivity, he gradually slid into a state of depression from which he never really recovered. He was unhappy with the constant stream of guests and tourists at the Finca Vigia, and when some of General Batista's soldiers clubbed to death his trusty old hound, Black Dog, when they raided the house looking for guns, he began to realize that it was time to make a permanent move back to the States. "Poor old Black Dog," he said. "I miss him in the early morning when I work. He's not here on the kudu skin beside the typewriter. And in the afternoon when I swim, he's not hunting lizards beside the pool. And in the evenings when I sit in my chair to read, his chin isn't resting on my foot. I miss Black Dog as much as I miss any friend I ever lost." He continued adding to and editing his works in progress, and in the summer of 1959, he visited Spain and his beloved Pamplona to research a series of bullfighting articles commissioned by Life magazine. He was interviewed by a young Irish journalist, Valerie Danby Smith, who he persuaded to come and work for him as his private secretary. In her book, she recalls that at this time, he was still full of life, reading 3 books a week, and with total recall ability. But others began to feel he was not himself. Life only wanted 10,000 words, but the manuscript grew out of control to 130,000 words, and he struggled to organize his writing for the first time in his life. So he asked friend and screenwriter A.E. Hochner to travel to Cuba for assistance. Hochner helped him trim the piece down for the magazine and prepare a longer book version, The Dangerous Summer, but described him as unusually hesitant, disorganized, and confused. Reluctant at first to accept Hochner's suggestions, he eventually agreed, writing in a letter, "I'll tell you, Hoch, it's like being in a fucking nightmare. I act cheerful like always, but I'm not. I'm bone-tired and very beat up emotionally." The political situation in Cuba was getting ever more complex. Castro had been in charge since early 1959, and his government had begun its agrarian reforms by nationalizing larger estates and foreign-owned landholdings, and tensions with the US were rising. As someone who did not like right-wing dictators, Hemingway had been broadly supportive of the revolution and even met Castro once, just for a few minutes, when, of all the things they could have talked about, they talked about fishing. But in July 1960, the Hemingways left Cuba forever. They rented an apartment off Central Park in New York, but Hemingway struggled to work as he missed the quiet and space of Finca Vigia and his cats. So he made what turned out to be his final trip to Spain, somewhere that always lifted his spirits. But this time, he took to his bed for several days and barely spoke, despite the first installments of The Dangerous Summer, published in Life, receiving good reviews. After arriving back in New York in October, he refused to leave his apartment, fearing he was being watched, so Mary took him back to Idaho. He was constantly worrying about money and his taxes, and that he would never be able to return to Cuba to retrieve the manuscripts and art he had left in a bank vault in Havana. And he became convinced the FBI was actively monitoring him. In Ketchum, his friend and doctor, George Saviers, flew him to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota at the end of November, checking him in under his own name to maintain anonymity. He was told it was for blood pressure treatment, as he would not have agreed to go otherwise, but it was really for treatment of his depression. His doctors told him his low mood may have been caused by his long-term use of rezapine and methylphenidate. Rezapine had been available since 1954 and was used as one of the early treatments for high blood pressure, and it did make some people depressed as a side effect. But it was also widely used in psychiatry for calming and treating people with agitated depression and psychosis. Methylphenidate, best known under the brand name Ritalin, was introduced to the US in 1957 and was initially used as a treatment for memory problems. Long-term use is associated with a slightly increased risk of depression. The medication could have contributed to his depression, but it seems to me far more likely that the main causative factors were his genetic inheritance, his 8 or 9 head injuries, and his drinking. He had a course of 10 to 15 electroconvulsive therapy, ECT treatments, in December and January. He had short-lived memory problems after the treatments, but this passed, and a secretary was brought in to help him deal with his correspondence, which he was able to do for several hours a day. His mood was brighter, he was less paranoid, and he went out to coffee shops with Mary. He even went trap shooting with one of his doctors, hitting 27 consecutive clay pigeons. He was almost well enough to attend President Kennedy's inauguration, to which he'd been invited, but in the end, he gave his apologies. He was discharged after 7 weeks and returned home. He was told he could drink wine, but no more than 1 litre, or 33 fluid ounces, a day. At first, he took long walks and went trap shooting most days, but by the end of March, his mood dropped again. He thought he had messed up his Paris memoirs, and one morning, his wife found him holding a shotgun in the kitchen. It was a struggle to get him back to the Mayo Clinic. He tried to open the door of the plane and jump out, and when it stopped to refuel, he tried to walk in front of the propellers of a taxiing plane. This time, he was assigned to a locked ward, where head of psychiatry Dr. Howard Rome diagnosed agitated depression, loss of self-esteem, ideas of worthlessness, and a searing sense of guilt. He was administered further shock treatments, 4 in the first 5 days, and, as before, he seemed to improve and was going out for walks in the local area. Mary, however, wasn't convinced, and feeling he was conning his psychiatrist that he was better, she looked into getting him transferred to the Institute of the Living in Hartford, Connecticut. But before she could make plans, he was discharged on the 26th of June, a 5-day drive later, and he was back home in Ketchum. At what turned out to be a final meal at Christiana's restaurant, he was worried by the presence of 2 salesmen who he thought were FBI agents. The next morning, Mary found him dead from a shotgun wound. Initially, she said it was an accident, and this allowed him to be buried in the Catholic cemetery. But in an interview 5 years later, she confirmed what everyone already knew, that he had deliberately shot himself. There is no denying that Ernest Hemingway had a huge influence on American literature with his unique, instantly recognizable style, lean, apparently simple, but hinting at so much unsaid beneath the surface. Not everyone liked his writing at the time, and there are plenty today who criticize some of the values they believe he represents, with some even calling for him to be cancelled. And yet, despite all the naysayers then and now, his books are still being read and discussed, and barely a year goes by without another biography or interpretation of his work of some kind. We know where it ended, but where did that struggle start? And how did his battle with his inner demons shape his tumultuous life and influence his writing? But before we get too psychological, we also have to think about his extraordinary physical health history of all those accidents and illnesses. What effect did they have on his brain and sense of himself? Poor eyesight, concussions in high school football, shrapnel wounds, machine gun wounds, hepatitis, the head injury from the Parisian hotel skylight, anthrax on honeymoon in the south of France, fractured ribs in the Pamplona bullring, the spiral fracture of his right arm and radial nerve damage from car crash number 1, amoebic dysentery and prolapsed rectum in Kenya, liver problems in Paris, another head injury from car crash number 2 in London, another head injury weeks later from a motorbike crash in Normandy, pneumonia in the Battle of the Bulge, erysipelas in Italy, multiple life-threatening injuries from 2 plane crashes in 2 days in Africa, a lacerated forehead in a car crash in Cuba, another concussion from slipping on the deck of the Pilar when drunk, high blood pressure, and diabetes. Quite a catalogue. And of course, accidents do not occur randomly. If you're impulsive and impatient and rush into everything with great gusto, you are more likely to become a casualty of your own enthusiasm. Hemingway was rarely lukewarm about anything. It was either full speed or don't bother, and this is why the list is so long. And it is quite possible that each head injury made him more reckless than before, increasing his risk of having another. Banging your head really isn't good for your brain. Banging your head repeatedly is even less good. And Hemingway had at least 8 or 9 separate head injuries that resulted in being dazed or losing consciousness. Hemingway had a drink problem. He knew it, too, and tried many times to reduce his drinking by setting himself rules and limits, such as never before noon. But he just couldn't stick to them, and visitors would often observe him having an eye-opener when he started work at 5 a.m., and continuing his work with a glass in hand. He started when he was 15, and at times drank a bottle of scotch a day, more when he was depressed. His liver was already showing signs of damage in 1937, when he was still in his 30s, but try as he might, he just couldn't stop. His drinking frequently made him irritable and belligerent, getting him into fights and leading to more knocks to his head when he fell over. Drinking to excess and risk-taking often occur in people who have experienced trauma, and Hemingway had more than his fair share. From the mutilated remains of the First World War munitions factory explosion to helping retrieve the bloated, decomposing bodies of the 400 souls washed away by the devastating hurricane that hit the Florida Keys in 1935. There were also the more domestic traumas of seeing his old dog clubbed to death and another shot by Batista soldiers in Cuba, and he was deeply affected by having to put down one of his cats that had been run over. It may seem strange that someone who happily blasted away at anything that moved in Africa and Idaho could be so distressed by the loss of a pet, but as he said himself, "I myself have had to shoot people, but never anyone I knew and loved for 11 years, nor anyone that purred with 2 broken legs." So despite his hard-living, tough guy image, he was quite a softie at heart, although he did do quite a good job at keeping it hidden. And let's face it, he wasn't great with relationships. 4 wives and numerous affairs attest to that. He once wrote that the things he loved were, in the following order, good soldiers, animals, and women. Personally, I'm not sure they were that high up, and I'm not convinced by the idea that it was his rejection by First World War nurse Agnes von Kurowski that led him to abandoning all subsequent women in his life before they could abandon him. I think that even if he had married Agnes, he would have moved on to someone else within a few years. It was part of his impulsive, novelty-seeking nature, like a magpie spotting a shiny bauble. He couldn't resist, and he would use all of his considerable charm to win each new bauble. He boasted once that he had bedded every girl he wanted, and some that he had not wanted. The less charming side of the great writer? As a father, he was equally hot and cold. Whenever he was with his boys, he would be with them all day fishing, hunting, skiing, goofing around. A great dad, and they loved being with him. But when they went back to their mothers, it was as if they didn't exist. So what can we conclude about his personality? I guess it depends on how much you like his writing. Bold, energetic, confident, determined, brave or restless, insecure, narcissistic, and dangerously reckless. There are stories that support all of these adjectives and many more. One of his most enduring character traits was his need to be the best. The best writer, of course, but also the best boxer, the best fisherman, the best hunter, the best journalist, and the best lover. He didn't like criticism and would permanently drop friends if they dared to cross him in any way. He could be warm and generous, but switch instantly to being bitter and envious. And he rarely, very rarely, apologized and made up. He enjoyed the company of men from all walks of life: writers, academics, sportsmen, soldiers, and guys with hard physical jobs but not psychiatrists. He avoided going anywhere near one until his final few months, and once said his Corona typewriter was his analyst. That hasn't stopped psychoanalysts having a go and hypothesizing about him, however. He acted often not through free choice, but because he was driven by some dimly understood internal pressure whose murky persuasiveness only shammed choice. He fished, hunted, and sought danger not because he wanted to, but because he had to, in order to escape some greater, internal danger. It is likely that his father, with his mood swings and need for extended rest cures, would nowadays be diagnosed with bipolar affective disorder. And this, combined with his mother's emotional dysregulation, was a toxic mix that would eventually lead to 3, possibly 4, of their 6 children taking their own lives. And there is a strong case for Ernest himself having what we would now call bipolar disorder. He had clear episodes of depression in 1936. When he was languishing in Key West with Pauline, he wrote a letter to Dos Passos. "I felt that gigantic bloody emptiness and nothingness, like I couldn't ever make love, fight right, and was all for death." Although he used a somewhat earthier word to describe his lack of libido, and the pendulum often swung rapidly in the other direction to periods of manic energy. As a youngster, he would sit up all night reading poetry, and in one sustained episode in 1924, Hadley described him as sky-high, emotionally intense, and ready to explode. His company was so difficult to tolerate that she stayed behind when he went off on one of his trips. Mostly, he was able to channel this energy into creative output. In this episode, he dashed off 7 short stories in a matter of weeks. In another, 10 years later, He wrote to his editor Maxwell Perkins that his latest stories contained the best writing I have ever produced, and he was the only writer at that time capable of such writing. During these episodes, his mind would be buzzing. He once wrote that he had taken to getting up about 2 or so in the morning and going out to the little house to work until daylight, because when you're writing on a book, you can't sleep. Your brain races at night, and you write all the stuff in your head. In his final years, there were no more highs to lift him. His mood sank ever deeper, and he became paranoid, thinking he was being watched and that he was going to get into trouble. But he was in trouble. His once faultless memory and ability to hold the complex structure of a novel in his mind was going. Those that knew him saw the decline accelerate in his final 18 months, and Hemingway could see it in himself. General Lanham, commander of the 22nd Infantry in Normandy, and perhaps Hemingway's closest friend for the last quarter of his life, once said to Hemingway's wife Mary that her husband was frozen in adolescence. When he heard of the remark later, he rejoined, "Perhaps adolescence isn't such a bad place to be frozen." But in July 1961, a few weeks before his 62nd birthday, his life came to an end. Thank you for listening. Subscribe for more.